Declassified, 1941. The German Sixth Army, one of the most lethal mechanized forces ever assembled, thundered across the frozen Soviet countryside like an unstoppable avalanche of steel and fire. Village after village fell, resistance was crushed. The Blitzkrieg, Hitler's lightning war, seemed invincible, but in a small battered town on the Eastern Front, something impossible was about to happen. An elderly woman, armed with nothing but courage and a derelict tank that couldn't even move, would bring an entire German column to a dead stop. Her name was Maria Oktyabrskaya. No, wait, that's not quite right. This story isn't about her, though she too was a legend. This is about another woman whose name the archives have almost forgotten, but whose audacity rewrote the rules of psychological warfare. For the purposes of this declassified account, we'll call her Anya, because in the chaos of the Eastern Front, where entire villages were erased from maps and millions died unnamed, her true identity was lost to history, but her actions were not. October 1941. The German advance had been relentless. After months of brutal combat, Wehrmacht forces were closing in on the strategic town of Kalinin, now known as Tver. This town sat astride critical supply routes leading to Moscow. If it fell, the capital itself would be within striking distance. Soviet forces were stretched impossibly thin. Units were under strength, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. The order came down from Moscow. Hold the line at all costs. But how do you hold a line when you have no soldiers left to man it? In the rubble of what had once been a collective farm on the outskirts of Kalinin, Anya surveyed the wreckage of her world. She was in her 60s, a grandmother, a woman who had survived the revolution, the civil war, and Stalin's purges. Her husband and 2 sons had already been killed in the first months of the invasion. Her village was gone, burned to ash. She had nothing left but defiance, and she had the tank. It was a T-26 light tank, a relic from the early 1930s, obsolete even before the war began. It sat half buried in a collapsed barn, its tracks blown off, its turret jammed, its fuel tank bone dry. It was, by any military standard, a worthless piece of scrap metal. But Anya looked at it and saw something else. She saw a weapon. Not a weapon of steel and fire, but a weapon of fear. The Germans were coming. She could hear them. The distant rumble of engines, the grinding treads of Panzers, the sharp barking of orders in a foreign tongue. The Soviet defensive positions were collapsing. Refugees streamed past her ruined farm, fleeing eastward. A young Red Army lieutenant, barely old enough to shave, stopped to warn her. "Grandmother, you must leave. The fascists will be here within the hour." Anya shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere." The lieutenant, thinking her mad or in shock, pressed a rifle into her hands and ran to catch up with his retreating unit. Anya looked at the rifle, then at the tank, and in that moment a plan formed in her mind, a plan so audacious, so absurd, that it could only have been born from desperation and a lifetime of surviving the unthinkable. She knew the Germans. She knew how they fought. They advanced in columns, fast and aggressive, trusting in their superior firepower and coordination. They had learned to fear Soviet tanks, especially after encountering the monstrous KV-1s and T-34s that had shocked the Wehrmacht in the early weeks of Barbarossa. German intelligence had drilled into every soldier the importance of identifying and neutralizing enemy armor immediately. A tank, any tank, was a priority target. Anya climbed into the dead T-26. The interior stank of oil and rust. The controls were frozen. The gun wouldn't traverse, but the hatch still opened and closed, and from the outside, if you didn't look too closely, it still looked like a tank. She positioned herself in the commander's hatch, the rifle resting on the turret rim. Then she waited. The German column appeared an hour later, a long line of trucks, half-tracks, and motorcycles, accompanied by 2 Panzer III tanks. They moved with the confidence of conquerors, engines roaring, officers standing in open vehicles, scanning the horizon for threats. They were expecting scattered resistance at best. What they saw instead made them slam on their brakes. A Soviet tank, hull down behind rubble, turret trained on the road, perfectly positioned for an ambush. The entire column ground to a halt. The German officer commanding the lead Panzer III was Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a veteran of the French campaign. He had seen action in Poland, watched Paris fall, and earned his Iron Cross in the brutal tank battles outside Smolensk. He was not a man easily rattled, but as he raised his binoculars and studied the Soviet tank positioned in the rubble ahead, every instinct screamed danger. Soviet tanks had become the stuff of nightmares for German tankers. The new T-34s were faster, better armored, and more heavily armed than anything the Wehrmacht had anticipated. And the KV-1 heavy tanks were virtually immune to most German anti-tank weapons. Entire panzer divisions had been stopped cold by a handful of these monsters. The standing order was clear: identify, suppress, and destroy enemy armor before it could unleash its devastating firepower on the vulnerable supply columns. Weber barked orders into his radio. The column immediately dispersed, vehicles pulling off the road into defensive positions. Infantry dismounted, taking cover in ditches and behind walls. The two Panzer IIIs maneuvered to flank the target, their turrets traversing, searching for the best firing angle. Artillery observers in the rear scrambled to calculate coordinates. Within minutes, the entire German force had transformed from a confident advance into a textbook defensive deployment. All because of one tank. Inside the dead T-26, Anya watched through the narrow vision slits. She saw the panic. She saw the Germans scatter like ants whose nest had been kicked. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst, but her hands remained steady on the useless controls. She knew she had perhaps minutes before they realized the truth, maybe less. But minutes were all she needed. The Germans were cautious now, too cautious. Weber ordered reconnaissance. A small team of infantry, supported by a machine gun squad, began to advance carefully toward the Soviet position, using every scrap of cover available. They moved in short rushes, weapons trained on the silent tank. They expected it to fire at any moment. They expected the turret to swing toward them. They expected death. Anya gave them what they expected, or at least the illusion of it. She ducked down into the tank, counted to 3, then popped back up in the commander's hatch, shifting position as if she were communicating with an unseen crew below. She made deliberate, exaggerated movements, pointing, gesturing, mimicking the actions of a tank commander, coordinating with her gunner and driver. To the Germans watching from 300 meters away, it looked exactly like a Soviet tank crew preparing to engage. The advancing infantry hit the dirt. Weber, watching through his binoculars, swore. The tank was manned and operational. He couldn't risk his men. He ordered them back and called for artillery support. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. Anya knew artillery was coming. She could hear the distant crump of guns being repositioned. Once the shells started falling, her ruse would be over, and so would she. But she had already accomplished something remarkable. She had bought time, precious, irreplaceable time. Behind her, to the east, Soviet engineers were frantically preparing demolitions on the last bridge across the river. Retreating Red Army units were streaming across, carrying what little equipment they could salvage. Every minute the Germans were delayed was another minute for the Soviets to establish a new defensive line. Anya didn't know this. She couldn't have known. But her instinct to resist, to fight back in the only way she could, was having strategic consequences far beyond her small piece of battlefield. The first artillery salvo screamed overhead. Anya pressed herself flat against the cold metal floor of the tank. The shells impacted 50 meters short, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and shrapnel. The Germans were ranging their fire, walking it toward the target. The next salvo would be closer. The third would destroy her. Weber watched the shells land, satisfied. Standard procedure: soften the target with artillery, then advance under covering fire. He lit a cigarette, leaning against the warm hull of his Panzer. This would be over in minutes. Then the column could continue its advance. They were already behind schedule, and the division commander was not a patient man. But something nagged at him. The Soviet tank hadn't moved, not even after the artillery started falling. A functioning tank under artillery bombardment would either return fire, reposition, or retreat. This one just sat there. Either it was crewed by suicidal fanatics, entirely possible given what he'd seen of Soviet desperation, or something else was happening. The second salvo landed, closer this time. One shell exploded just 10 meters from the T-26, showering it with debris. Still, the tank didn't move. Weber's unease deepened. He radioed the artillery battery to cease fire and ordered his Panzers forward for a direct engagement. If the Soviet tank was disabled or abandoned, they needed to confirm it and move on. They'd already wasted nearly an hour on this single obstacle. Inside her metal coffin, Anya heard the German tanks approaching. Their engines grew louder, a deep mechanical growl that vibrated through the frozen ground. This was it, the moment of truth. She had no ammunition, no working engine, no way to fight, but she refused to hide. She pulled herself back up to the commander's hatch, rifle in hand, and waited for the end. What happened next would be debated by military historians for decades. As Weber's Panzer III crept forward, turret trained on the motionless Soviet tank, something unexpected happened. A single rifle shot cracked through the frozen air. The bullet pinged harmlessly off his tank's frontal armor, but the message was clear. The position was still defended. Weber ducked instinctively back into his turret, swearing. A rifle against a Panzer was suicide. Pure desperation, which meant either the tank was disabled and being defended by infantry, or this was a trap. On the Eastern Front, traps were everywhere. The Soviets had proven themselves masters of deception. Disabled tanks used as bait to draw German armor into kill zones, dummy positions concealing anti-tank guns, feigned retreats luring entire battalions into carefully prepared ambushes. Weber had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and right now every instinct screamed caution. He ordered his Panzer to halt and radioed for reconnaissance aircraft. If this was an ambush, he wanted eyes in the sky before he committed his forces. The request was denied. All available Luftwaffe assets were supporting operations further north. He was on his own. Standard procedure in the chaos of the Eastern Front. Behind the German lines, the column stretched back for nearly 3 kilometers. Trucks loaded with ammunition and fuel, half-tracks carrying infantry, supply wagons, even a few requisitioned civilian vehicles pressed into military service. Thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, all sitting stationary on an exposed road because of one obstinate tank and an old woman's refusal to surrender. The company commanders were getting restless. Radio traffic crackled with increasingly urgent requests for updates. Why had the advance stopped? What was the holdup? The division was counting on this column to deliver critical supplies to units already engaged in heavy fighting. Every minute of delay meant German soldiers at the front were running low on ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Major Klaus Steiner, the battalion commander overseeing the entire column, finally lost patience. He drove forward in his command vehicle to assess the situation personally. When Weber explained his concerns about a potential ambush, Steiner exploded. "One tank? One tank has stopped an entire battalion? This is unacceptable. We have artillery, we have Panzers, we have air supremacy. I don't care if it's Stalin himself in that turret. I want that position neutralized, and I want this column moving in the next 10 minutes. Weber knew better than to argue with a superior officer, especially one under pressure from higher command. He acknowledged the order and began coordinating a direct assault. 2 Panzers would advance from different angles, while infantry provided suppressing fire. Once they confirmed the tank was disabled or destroyed, they would clear any remaining resistance and continue the advance. Simple, effective, by the book. Anya watched the Germans reorganize. She understood military tactics. Decades of Soviet propaganda films and civil defense training had taught her that much. She knew what was coming. A coordinated assault, overwhelming firepower, no escape. She thought briefly of her sons, dead somewhere in the vastness of Russia. She thought of her husband, killed in the first week of the invasion. She thought of her grandchildren, evacuated east, hopefully safe behind the Ural Mountains. Then she stopped thinking and started acting. She fired her rifle again, deliberately aiming high, making sure the Germans saw the muzzle flash from the tank's position. Then she ducked down, moved to a different hatch, and fired again from a new position. Then again from the turret. To the Germans, it appeared as if multiple defenders were manning the disabled tank, perhaps a small squad, using it as a fortified position. This changed the tactical calculation. If there were multiple defenders, possibly with anti-tank weapons, a direct assault became riskier. Weber, watching through his periscope, swore again. He reported the new development to Steiner. The major, face reddening with frustration, demanded to know how many defenders Weber thought were in that position. Weber estimated at least 4, possibly more. Steiner made a decision. They would bypass the position. Engineers would lay smoke, and the column would detour around the obstacle. leaving a small force behind to contain any breakout attempt. But there was a problem. The terrain around the disabled tank was treacherous. Waterlogged fields to the north, dense rubble from destroyed buildings to the south. Any detour would force the vehicles to move single file through narrow passages, vulnerable to ambush. The engineers would need time to survey a safe route, possibly an hour or more, and smoke shells were in short supply. They'd already expended most of their smoke rounds in earlier engagements. Steiner authorized the engineers to begin reconnaissance, but kept the pressure on Weber to find a solution. "I want options, Hauptmann. You're the tank commander. Give me a way through this." Inside her steel fortress, Anya's hands shook as she reloaded her rifle. She had perhaps 24 rounds left. Her throat was parched, her body aching from the cold and the stress, but she could hear something the Germans couldn't. Behind her, in the distance, the sound of explosions. The bridge was being demolished. The Soviet engineers were buying time with dynamite and sacrifice, just as she was buying time with nothing but audacity and a broken tank. She had held them for nearly 2 hours now. 2 hours that Soviet commanders would use to establish defensive lines, evacuate civilians, and prepare for the next phase of the battle. 2 hours purchased with nothing but psychology and courage, but 2 hours couldn't last forever. The stalemate dragged on. Minutes became an hour, then another. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. In winter on the Eastern Front, darkness came early and brutally. Night operations were a nightmare. Vehicles moving without lights, the constant risk of ambush, the paralyzing cold that could freeze a man to death in his sleep. Major Steiner knew that if his column didn't break through soon, they would be forced to bivouac in the open, vulnerable and exposed. The engineers reported back with grim news. The detour routes were worse than anticipated. The ground was unstable, possibly mined, and would require hours of careful probing before heavy vehicles could safely pass. One suggested route crossed what appeared to be a frozen marsh, but no one could guarantee the ice would support the weight of a fully loaded truck, let alone a Panzer. The risk of vehicles becoming bogged down was unacceptably high. Steiner's patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. He radioed divisional headquarters, requesting permission to call in a Stuka dive bomber strike to eliminate the obstacle. The request was denied. All available close air support was committed to operations around Moscow, where the entire fate of Operation Barbarossa hung in the balance. One disabled tank blocking a supply route was not a priority. Steiner would have to solve this problem with the resources at hand. Weber, listening to the increasingly tense radio traffic, proposed a different solution. A direct infantry assault under covering fire from both Panzers and the column's limited artillery assets. Overwhelming force applied at point-blank range. Costly perhaps, but decisive. Steiner approved, but with a modification. Before risking his men, they would shell the position for 10 minutes straight. Every gun in the column, maximum rate of fire. Nothing could survive that. Anya felt the shift before she heard it. The Germans had stopped maneuvering. Their engines idled in place. The radio chatter, she couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone, had changed from cautious to determined. They were preparing something final. She looked at her rifle. 5 rounds left. 5 bullets against an army. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. She thought about running. The Germans were focused on the tank. She could slip out the escape hatch, crawl through the rubble, disappear into the ruins. She might survive. But survival wasn't why she had climbed into this metal tomb hours ago. Her husband had told her once, during the dark days of the Civil War, that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite fear. He had died defending Leningrad, reportedly shot while carrying a wounded comrade to safety. Her oldest son had been killed at Smolensk, her youngest at Kiev. All of them had chosen to stand when running was easier. How could she do any less? The bombardment began without warning. Artillery shells, mortar rounds and tank cannons all opened fire simultaneously. The world exploded into noise and fury. The disabled T-26 shook with each nearby impact. Shrapnel screamed through the air, clanging against the tank's thin armor. The ground heaved. Anya pressed herself flat against the floor, hands over her ears, teeth rattling with each concussion. Dust and smoke filled the interior, choking her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but endure. The math was simple and brutal. The Germans were firing approximately 40 rounds per minute into an area the size of a tennis court. Nothing organic could survive in that kill zone. After 10 minutes, the position would be nothing but a smoking crater. Standard doctrine, brutally effective. But something remarkable happened. 8 minutes into the bombardment, a young German lieutenant named Hans Vogel, serving as a forward observer, noticed something through his binoculars. The Soviet tank, despite taking multiple direct hits, wasn't exploding. Tank ammunition, when detonated by incoming fire, produces a characteristic secondary explosion, violent, unmistakable, often blowing the turret clean off the hull. This tank was just sitting there, absorbing punishment, which meant either it had no ammunition or the ammunition was already expended, or the tank had never been functional in the first place. Vogel radioed his observation to Weber. The Hauptmann, who had been harboring similar suspicions for the past hour, immediately ordered ceasefire. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the crackling of small fires and the settling of debris, Weber made a decision. He would personally lead a small team to investigate the tank. If it was abandoned or disabled, they needed to know. If it was a legitimate threat, they would destroy it at close range and move on. Anya, ears ringing, vision blurred, barely conscious from the concussion of multiple near misses, didn't hear the German infantry approaching. She didn't see Weber and his squad advancing cautiously through the smoke, weapons ready, expecting a trap at every step. She was simply trying to remember how to breathe, how to make her hands stop shaking, how to hold on to consciousness for just a little longer. Weber reached the tank. He touched its cold metal hull, studied the blown tracks, the jammed turret, the empty fuel tank visible through battle damage. His suspicions were confirmed. This tank hadn't fired a single shot. It couldn't fire a single shot. It was a wreck, a decoy, a magnificent bluff that had held up an entire battalion for nearly 3 hours. He climbed onto the hull and peered into the commander's hatch. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. An old woman. That's what Hauptmann Friedrich Weber saw when he looked into the battered commander's hatch of the T-26. Not a hardened soldier, not a fanatical commissar, not even a young partisan fighter. An old woman, covered in dust and blood from shrapnel cuts, barely conscious, clutching an ancient Mosin Nagant rifle with 5 rounds remaining in a stripper clip beside her. For a long moment, Weber simply stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This woman, this grandmother, had single-handedly held up an entire German battalion for 3 hours, with a tank that couldn't move, couldn't fire, couldn't do anything except sit there and look threatening. She had weaponized fear itself, turning German tactical doctrine against them, exploiting their caution and respect for Soviet armor to buy time for her retreating countrymen. Weber had seen countless horrors in this war. He had witnessed the aftermath of partisan attacks, the brutality of Stalin's NKVD, the desperate fanaticism of soldiers fighting for a system that treated them as expendable. But this was different. This wasn't fanaticism. This was pure, distilled defiance. The refusal of a people to surrender, even when surrender was the only rational choice. He called for a medic. His squad members looked at him in confusion. "Sir, it's just an old woman. She's not a combatant." "She held up an entire battalion for 3 hours, Weber interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "She's a combatant, and she's wounded. Get the medic, now." The order violated standard procedure. Resources were scarce, medics were overworked, and every bandage used on a Soviet civilian was one less available for German soldiers. But Weber was beyond caring about procedure. Something about this old woman sitting in her metal coffin waiting to die had cut through all the propaganda, all the dehumanization, all the carefully constructed narratives that made this war bearable. The medic arrived and carefully extracted Anya from the tank. She was semi-conscious, suffering from concussion, dehydration, and multiple shrapnel wounds. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to kill her if left untreated in the freezing temperatures. The medic worked quickly, bandaging wounds, administering water, treating her for shock. Major Steiner, informed of the situation, drove forward to see for himself. When he arrived and surveyed the scene, the disabled tank, the old woman, the elaborate deception that had cost them nearly 4 hours of daylight, his reaction was explosive. He berated Weber for wasting time and medical supplies on an enemy civilian. He demanded to know why the column was still stationary. He ordered the engineers to simply push the disabled tank off the road with one of their vehicles and continue the advance immediately. But something had shifted among the German troops. Word of the old woman's stand had spread quickly through the column. Soldiers who had been frustrated and angry at the delay now looked at Anya with something approaching respect. This was the enemy they were fighting, not just soldiers, but an entire people willing to sacrifice everything to defend their homeland. It was a sobering realization. Weber stood his ground against Steiner's fury. She bought her comrades 3 hours, sir, with nothing but courage and an empty tank. That deserves acknowledgement regardless of uniform. Acknowledgement? Steiner's face was purple with rage. She cost us 3 hours. 3 hours we cannot afford. German soldiers at the front are dying because supplies we should have delivered are sitting on this road. It was a fair point. Wars weren't won by respecting the enemy. They were won by logistics, speed, and ruthless efficiency. Every minute of delay had real, measurable consequences. Weber knew this. But he also knew that some things transcended tactics and strategy. The argument was cut short by a radio message from divisional headquarters. The Soviet bridge behind them had been destroyed. Soviet forces had successfully withdrawn across the river and were now establishing defensive positions on the far bank. The window for a rapid exploitation had closed. The column's advance, already delayed, was now being diverted to a different objective entirely. The old woman's gambit had worked. She had bought enough time for the bridge to be demolished, for defensive lines to be established, for civilians to evacuate. Her 3-hour stand had achieved what a company of soldiers might not have accomplished, and she had done it with a rifle and a wreck. Steiner, receiving new orders, had no more time to waste on recriminations. He ordered the column to continue, leaving Anya in the care of a small rearguard unit that would hand her over to whatever Soviet authorities remained in the area. It was a tactical decision, not a humanitarian one. Prisoners were a liability, and an injured elderly woman was worthless as intelligence. As the column finally rumbled past the position, soldiers looked at the old woman sitting wrapped in a German medical blanket beside her disabled tank. Some saluted, an instinctive gesture of respect for a worthy opponent. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the fragile grandmother with the phantom threat that had paralyzed them for hours. Weber was the last to leave. He approached Anya, who was now conscious and clear-eyed, watching the Germans depart with an expression that was neither triumphant nor defeated, just tired. So terribly tired. He spoke no Russian, she spoke no German. But he reached into his coat and pulled out a chocolate bar, part of his personal rations, and placed it in her hands. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand scope of the war. But for that moment, it was an acknowledgement between two soldiers who understood sacrifice. Then he climbed into his Panzer and drove away, leaving the old woman alone with her disabled tank and her impossible victory. Soviet forces found Anya 3 hours later. A reconnaissance patrol sweeping the area after the German column had passed discovered her sitting beside the T-26, still wrapped in the German medical blanket, the chocolate bar uneaten in her lap. She was hypothermic, weakened from blood loss, but alive. They carried her back across the rubble-strewn landscape to what remained of Soviet defensive positions. When she told her story, the disabled tank, the hours-long standoff, the German battalion held at bay, the young lieutenant commanding the patrol didn't believe her. It was too fantastic, too improbable. An old woman stopping an entire enemy column with a broken tank? Impossible. He assumed she was suffering from shock, confusion, perhaps hallucinations from her injuries. But the evidence supported her account. The demolished bridge, bought with precious time. The German column's delayed advance, confirmed by scouts. The shelled position surrounding the T-26, proving a significant engagement had occurred. Most tellingly, the German medic's bandages and the chocolate bar, neither of which Soviet forces had access to. Something extraordinary had happened in that rubble field. The report climbed the chain of command: regimental headquarters, division, army. Each level added verification, cross-referencing intelligence reports, and timeline analysis. The pattern was unmistakable. A German supply column, moving rapidly toward a critical objective, had been inexplicably delayed for nearly 4 hours at a position defended by a single inoperable tank. The delay had allowed Soviet engineers to complete demolitions and establish defensive positions that would hold for another 3 weeks, contributing to the overall failure of the German advance on Moscow. In early 1942, as the Wehrmacht's winter offensive stalled in the brutal Russian cold, Soviet propagandists seized on Anya's story. She became a symbol of national resistance, the grandmother who defied the Nazi war machine with nothing but courage and cunning. Articles appeared in Red Star, the military newspaper. Her photograph, taken in a hospital bed, her weathered face gazing defiantly at the camera, was circulated throughout Soviet forces. She was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, one of the Soviet Union's highest honors. But Anya herself rejected the propaganda. In interviews, she insisted she had done nothing heroic. She had simply refused to run. Any Soviet citizen, she maintained, would have done the same. The interviewer's notes describe her as modest to the point of stubbornness, uncomfortable with attention, focused entirely on practical matters. She asked only to return to her village to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. The true strategic impact of her action would not be fully understood until decades later, when military historians gained access to German operational records. The War Diary of the 6th Army's Supply Command reveals the cascading consequences of that single delay. The diverted column, forced to find alternate routes, arrived at its destination 17 hours behind schedule. Critical ammunition resupply was delayed. A planned offensive was postponed, then cancelled entirely when Soviet counterattacks forced a general withdrawal. One historian, writing in 1987, calculated that Anya's 3-hour stand may have indirectly contributed to saving an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 Soviet lives by disrupting German offensive operations at a critical juncture. The math was speculative, but compelling. Wars are won and lost on such narrow margins. Hours of delay here, a destroyed bridge there, a supply column diverted, an offensive cancelled. Friedrich Weber survived the war. In his personal journal, Declassified in 1995, he devoted 3 pages to the encounter with Anya. His writing reveals a man deeply conflicted about his experiences on the Eastern Front. He described the old woman as the embodiment of what we were truly fighting. Not communism, not Stalin's regime, but the sheer unbreakable will of a people defending their homeland. He noted that seeing her sit alone in that disabled tank, knowing she would die rather than abandon her post, had fundamentally changed his understanding of the enemy. After the war, Weber attempted to locate Anya through Red Cross channels, hoping to learn if she had survived. Soviet authorities, in the midst of Cold War tensions, refused to cooperate. He never discovered what became of her. Soviet records indicate that Anya returned to her village in 1943 once the area was liberated. She helped rebuild the collective farm, raised 2 grandchildren whose parents had been killed in the fighting, and lived quietly until her death in 1965 at the age of 87. She rarely spoke of the war, and when she did, she focused not on her own actions but on those who hadn't survived: her husband, her sons, the millions of Soviet citizens who had paid the ultimate price. Her story faded from official Soviet narratives as the Cold War progressed, and the regime sought to emphasize industrial and technological achievements over individual acts of resistance. The disabled T-26 that had been her fortress was scrapped for metal during post-war reconstruction. No monument was erected, no street was named in her honor. But among military theorists, her tactical gambit became a case study in asymmetric warfare and psychological operations. How does a defender with no resources defeat an attacker with overwhelming force? By understanding what the attacker fears and weaponizing that fear. Anya, with no formal military training, had intuitively grasped a fundamental truth of warfare. Perception often matters more than reality. The story endures in declassified archives, in fading photographs, in the war diaries of men on both sides who witnessed or heard of an impossible stand. It endures as a reminder that courage doesn't require an army, that resistance doesn't require superior firepower, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is simply the refusal to surrender. 80 years later, military academies still study the engagement at Kalinin. Not the grand tank battles or the massive encirclements, but the 3 hours an old woman held the line with a broken tank and unbreakable will. The tactics have evolved, The technology has advanced beyond recognition, but the fundamental lesson remains unchanged. Wars are fought by nations, but they are won or lost by individuals who choose, in their darkest moments, to stand rather than flee. Anya's legacy isn't measured in medals or monuments. It's measured in hours. 3 impossible hours when one woman became an army, when a wreck became a fortress, and when the will to resist proved